First of all, my only claim to fame is that I can't say my father anymore because I have so many relatives here, but our father was the owner of the Lady Rose when it came to Fort Alberni. So I was fortunate enough to be brought up. It hit me at just the perfect time in my life as a youngster, and it's been part of our life ever since it came to the Alberta Valley. I did make some talking notes, and I was going to I thought maybe we'd be talking to people that didn't know anything about the Lady Rose, so I'll start right from scratch a little bit. Everybody knows the Lady Rose was built in Scotland, 1937, and it was probably built knowing that it was going to be an iconic vessel in that it was going to be the first single propeller, diesel-powered ship to cross the Atlantic. So it probably had the best of that era in 1937. And that included being cold riveted. In those days, the ships that were being built, they were built more out of an iron than a steel. Welcome, come in. These are fellow yachties from the waterfront too, by the way. The ship was built out of an iron, which is close to what we build ships out of now, which is steel, but it had less carbon in it. And the fact that it was riveted and cold riveted made it exceptionally strong because the rivets being cold, they didn't have any access to shrinkage, and they were actually able to put the rivets in with a bedding compound, probably white lead back in that era. So it was unique. And something unique about building a steel ship in those days that most people don't realize is that they used to build them facing north and south. The reason for that is because all the hammering on the steel, or the iron, helps to align the magnetic field of a piece of steel. I can tell you a little story about that later, but that's just something to remember. In those days, that's what they used to do. When they were hammering on the steel ships all the time, they tried to build them in a north-south position. The engine in the Lady Rose was probably the best of the best in those days. It was a diesel. It was 6-cylinder. It had independent cylinder heads. And one of the unique things about the diesel at that time was that it had a pre-combustion chamber. This means I'm not going to shout anymore.
You don't have to shout, you don't have to get your voice all hoarse. Here you go, you can speak into the mic right there.
There we go. So, would it help?
And you talk a little bit, we'll just turn it up for you.
1, 2, 3. Does it help?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is that better?
That's good, Joe.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so the diesel that was put in was a national diesel, and unique in that time was that it didn't have to be stopped and started in reverse, which was pretty common for big diesel engines in those days because they didn't have gearboxes and clutches like we have now. The national diesel that was in the Lady Rose didn't have a reduction, but it didn't have to be stopped and then started in the other direction when the ship had to go astern. All it had was a big lever to go back and forth. The other thing about it, it was air start. And air, because back in those days they didn't have the electronics that we have now, they didn't have all the high torque electricity and everything. So air was used an awful lot for machinery, for winches, and the starting of the engine was by injecting air into the top of the cylinder and actually turning it over that way. Now the air that they used was fresh air. Anyways, they didn't have to use high pressure in those days. They didn't, it was easy to make a compressor, and everything was done with high volume. So the amount of air pressure that was used was less than 400 pounds. And that necessitated that the ship have a huge air tank built into it. So when they constructed the ship, one of the first things they put in the basement was this monstrous air tank, which was a riveted air tank. And if we have time, I'll tell you a little story about that air tank one day. But the other thing is the air was also used for anchoring, for running the anchor windlass, like a big steam engine, and the windlass for raising and lowering the cargo back in those days was air instead of hydraulic. I mentioned the air. One of the things that the air was used for was for assisting in the steering. The steering was old school, but it never broke down once. It was cables, rods, and chains. And there was a big cylinder in the steering mechanism that when the skipper was maneuvering and couldn't turn the wheel, hard enough and fast enough, he injected air with the famous brass handle. And if you look at all the photographs, you'll see in the wheelhouse, you'll see that brass handle sticking out. And if I explained to somebody once, I must have explained it 100 times or 1,000 times what that handle is for. This is a photograph of the Lady Rose as it was when it arrived from Scotland. And you'll see it has those square windows in the stern, and it had a beautiful teak wheelhouse. Over the years, the teak was painted, and with our ridiculous Canadian government, they insisted that the square windows be taken out and portholes put in. And it wasn't until the owner, after our father owned it, that the square windows could be replaced instead of the round portholes. Yeah, I don't know much about the trip across. I wasn't there. It did make it. It came obviously through the Panama Canal. It didn't go around Cape Horn, so I don't have a globe to show you the route. And when it came to Port Alberta, or came to Canada, it was commissioned for the Union steamships. It was commissioned to sail from Vancouver up the inside of Vancouver Island. And the other thing about the Lady Rose, it was actually first of all christened as the Lady Cynthia. But it turned out when it got here, there was already a Lady Cynthia. She was apparently very famous. So they changed the name from Lady Cynthia to Lady Rose. So when the Union steamships ran her, she became famous for serving all the little towns all the way up to Gibson's and the Broughton Islands and up the inside. And things developed faster and faster, and it soon became, it was too small a vessel, and it was replaced with larger and larger ships, and it was put aside. And in the 1950s, it was not doing anything when it became necessary to have a better ship in Port Alberni. So what was happening in the Alberni Inlet was the shipping that used to service the entire west coast of Vancouver Island was mostly coming from Victoria and Vancouver. There were large ships like the Maquina and the Mashagon that were making the trip on the outside of Vancouver Island to go into places like Tofino and Ucluelet and Banfield. But as Port Alberni became developed and had a railway and more people lived here, it became more logical that the shipping to these remote places start at Port Alberni. And in those days, there were 3 ships called the Uchucks. Now that's another story in itself, the Uchuck ships. But there was 1, 2, and 3. The Uchuck number 1 was just a tiny little ship, about 65 feet long. The number 2 was actually a converted ferry boat, which wasn't overly seaworthy. It had big windows and was very little freeboard. And the Uchuck number 3 was a converted YMS, which was a military ship made out of timber, but it was actually a minesweeper ship from the Second World War. And those ships were operated by the Young family. S.N. Young was the key man, and George McCann was his partner. And like I said, that's another story, but the Uchuck era dominated the Alberni Inlet. They were back and forth until they got a little bit concerned that their service wasn't going to be required. So the Uchuck 2 was sold, and the Uchuck 3 went up to Nootka Sound. And the number 1 was left behind, and my father, our father, who was that time an engineer, took over the Uchuck 1 with his new partner, Dick McMinn, who was an ex-Navy man. And they formed the partnership to use the Uchuck 1 to service Banfield and Ucluelet and Sarita and Kildonan and all those places. It took not very long to realize it was far too small. So they started hunting and they found the Lady Rose in Vancouver and picked it up and brought it around to service instead of the Uchuck 1. I don't remember when it arrived, maybe my sister does, but anyway. I was about 12 years old, I suppose. And it was the beginning of the era for the Lady Rose. And Dick McMinn was my father's partner, and my dad, who was an engineer at the time, they ran it, and they had to have a skipper, they had to have a mate and a deckhand at the same time, and it became a very successful little business. my father went and decided he didn't want to be an engineer all the time, and he went and wrote his master's ticket. And in the meantime, he was teaching me just about everything I could learn handling the engines in the Lady Rose. Now don't forget, I should have mentioned earlier, but in those days, the engine couldn't be controlled from up on the bridge. The levers were too big, and the maneuvers had to be done with too many movements. And there were no servos, and there were no cables to do it. So the old telegraph was what we used. Now, everybody's looked at the telegraph here, and they know how the telegraphs work. There's a head in the wheelhouse, and there's a telegraph head in the engine room. And when the skipper wants to ask for a maneuver, he moves the lever back and forth and points the needle so that down below it points to what the skipper is requesting. If he wants half speed, the needle in the engine room points to half. The engineer adjusts the speed and it goes to half. It's a pretty simple but pretty crude system, and the engineer and the skipper would develop a form of communication so that the skipper, if he wanted half ahead in a bit of a hurry, if he's maneuvering, he would ding, 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 ding quite quickly. But if he just wanted to slowly spring the line ahead or something, he would ding, 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 and you could tell right away what he was asking for. And the communication was pretty good, as long as the skipper and the engineer were getting along. One of the signals that the skipper asks for, if the ship is going down the inlet or someplace and it's a nice sunny day, the engineer might be up having a coffee or anything. So when it's getting close to going into a harbor or whatever, the skipper will go ding, 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 and put the engineer on standby. Well, the engineer goes down there and ding, 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 I'm on standby. And then they get into the harbor and then, okay, stop engines. And if the maneuver goes pretty well, and usually it did, then the signals and the maneuvers would be 2 or 3 ahead in the stern and that. But if the engineer and the skipper weren't getting along too well, or if the engineer thought he knew more than the skipper as far as what the ship was doing, oftentimes when he asked for half ahead, he got a half and a half ahead. And it was, oftentimes there was a little bit of miscommunication. And one of the incidents that I recall quite clearly was, we were heading towards Banfield, and I was about 14 years old. My dad had taught me how to run the engine, put it ahead and put it astern and that sort of thing. We're going in toward Banfield. Ding, 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 come on, go on standby. Jack Howitt was the engineer at the time. There was no reply. You could hear the bells all over the ship. That's funny. So we're getting closer to going into the harbor. Ding, 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 go on standby. There's no reply. So I'm kind of curious, and obviously the ding, 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 ding was getting louder and faster. So I thought, I better have a look at this. And I started just going down, and there's Jack Howard in the engine room, looking up at the window, and I looked, and he and Dick McMinn had a little argument. So he was giving Dick a bit of a thrill. There we were steaming into the Banfield Inlet with no place to go but right up the inlet and onto the rocks, until Jack Howard figures, ding, ding, I'm here. So the communication was, often not just what you expected. I actually asked my father that evening, I said, I heard what was going on, and should I have gone down and answered? And I can remember the answer. Well, of course you should have. Anyway, another little thing about the controlling the engine from the engine room was in the 1960s, the Lady Rose was getting tired and the big old engine was getting very tired, so they decided that they were going to put in a new engine. Jack Howitt was the engineer, and he was out on the U-Chuck 1. The Lady Rose was tied up, and my father wanted to move the Lady Rose into the dry dock. So I was in grade 10. I get a call, and Dad comes and picks me up, and I was down in the engine room, operating the engine when it went into the dry dock. And it turned out that was the last time the engine was run. So I was given the brass handle off of the old engine. So, and I was told that that was a pretty special moment because of all the other engineers that have done it. Anyway, so many things about Lady Rose back in that era. We never had radar. The trip up the inlet went whether it was foggy or not. And most of the other vessels didn't have radars. So at 8 o'clock in the morning when it was time to leave, thick fog, the whistle was the only thing. You had to start blowing whistles, and they would steer by the course. Every course had been logged, and the time between each point was logged, so you know how long it would take to get to one point. And Dick McMahon and my father would blow the whistle and listen. If they knew they were a long ways from where there was a headland, they'd blow a long blast on the whistle and listen to get the echo. As they approached the headland, they'd blow a shorter blast and a shorter echo until they knew exactly when they reached the headland, and then they'd alter course, put it on the time, and go for the right course and the right time for the next point. And that's the way they went, up and down the inlet. And other vessels were doing the same thing. If a tug was coming in, her sister had a little boy, and she said, I don't know.
No, I'm not told because I was a little boy.
Well, I thought it was a story, so I'll start us off with my small story about the Lady Rose. I moved here to Port Alberni in the mid-'80s, and I was a keen scuba diver at the time and joined the local dive club, the Barkley Sounders Dive Club. There was a lot of dive clubs around in those days, and we used to invite other dive clubs to come and have an event at ours, and they would likewise invite us to go. And our event, which we did for a number of years, was a Lady Rose cruise down Barkley Sound, and we would anchor and dive 2 dives, and then we would have dinner, seafood dinner on the boat, and head back. And it was very popular. We were the highlight of the diving here. People came from the Lower Mainland and all over the island. We'd have 30, sometimes more divers on the boat. Plus, they'd bring their wives and kids, and so there'd be a pretty good crew on the boat. And I remember we had some amazing dives. I think I saw the biggest octopus I ever saw on one of those dives. And I was diving with a fellow from North Vancouver who had never even seen an octopus before. And this thing was immense. It had, anyway, he's still talking about that dive, I'm sure. But anyway, I remember, one of the things I remember clearly about diving off the Lady Rose is that they would announce, the skipper, Brooke George, would announce please don't flush the head when the divers are in the water. Because guess what, there's no holding tanks, right? So one of my first dives, and the protocol is you would jump into you'd be 4 divers in a group, and you jump in through the freight door, swim forward to the anchor chain, till you get your group together, and then you would all go down the anchor chain together. So simple enough. So I'm swimming along the edge, the front of the boat, or the side of the boat, get towards the anchor chain, and jet comes this. What up? Right in my face mask. Oh, that's so nice. So it wasn't just the garbage that you guys were throwing overboard, it was everything else was also going overboard as well. But you just keep swimming and everything's fine.
It's no shit.
No shit.
Big ocean. All right, that's my story. Who's next? Okay, Joe's back up.
I'm just going to keep it up until somebody else comes here. One of the iconic things about the relationship between our father and Dick McMahon is that they were as different as my wife would say as chalk and cheese. Dick McMahon was a staunch Irishman with a turtleneck and a pipe and a laugh you could hear all over the ship. And my father was a bit of a character, and I was having a good time. But one of the things, they were both traditionalists. They both liked things done shipshape and properly. And if my dad saw anything that wasn't tidy, like a lashing that was blowing in the wind or a rope that wasn't coiled up, Dick McMinn was Irish, and my father would always say, "Fix that Irish pennant, would you?" Or "Fix that Irish pennant, it's blowing in the breeze." And I just thought that that was the name for anything that flapped in the breeze, an Irish pennant. Well, Dick McMinn and John Monrufet were in the wheelhouse, and I came up from down below, and I was about 14 years old, and I wanted to be an adult, and I'm looking around, and I saw this thing blowing in the breeze. Nobody else was doing anything, so I said, "I'm going to go fix that Irish pennant." There were some very red faces in the wheelhouse. So, somebody else must have another story. Rachel did lots of trips on the Lily Rose.
Yes, I did, and they were all fantastic. Heaps and heaps of memories, and they were absolutely my childhood, and they all kind of blend into one. And I remember all of our trips that we went down there, and I felt like I owned the ship, and I know I was a big nuisance, and I'd go up and down the ladder from the up top down into the engine room, and thought that I was all that for being allowed to do that, and showing off to everybody else on the boat, probably a big pain. I know that's where I learned that apple juice tastes the same coming up as it does going down, so that's why I learned that I got seasick quite often, but it was always worth it. I love those trips very much. One for the trips themselves, they were beautiful and amazing, but also where it took us. My childhood in Downfield, growing up there for our long weekends and holidays, they were all pretty fantastic. But again, they do. I have probably so many stories I could say, and they all blend into one. I can't remember all the different ages that I would have been, but one of my most, as far as being an adult, my best memory is I got married down at Seashard Lodge, and it was all for the Lady Rose. So that all my friends, I think there was about 120 of us piled onto the Lady Rose, and
Couldn't have been more than 100.
oh, okay, it was 100 then, let's just say 100. I don't know. We filled it up, and we actually had a B list for our wedding because we couldn't fit everybody on the boat. So it was pretty horrible. We're like, well, you didn't make the cut for the boat, but we'll see you after. And but it was so important to me to have the Lady Rose as part of our wedding because that would meant the world to me. So it was worth that. And yeah, gosh. I'm sorry, I'm sure I could do better than that, but they were all pretty spectacular.
What's the status of the boat today?
What is the status of the boat?
Yeah.
Well, I guess to fill in a little bit, when our father decided he should retire, he sold it to a businessman from Victoria who owned it and just thought of it as an investment. And the businessman very quickly sold it to the next iconic owner of the Lady Rose, Brooke George. And Brooke was a sharp, very, very smart businessman. He was also a good mariner. He loved the ship, and he developed the new waterfront structure there with the Lady Rose, and the Francis Barclay ties up now. So I'm getting to answer your question. So after a while, and Brooke went to the Netherlands and bought the Francis Barclay, and the Lady Rose could only carry 100 passengers. It had asbestos paint. The government required a crew of 5, and it just wasn't going to make any money. So Brooke tied it up for the longest time, and then he put it up for sale. There were no bites. I had some wonderful ideas, but there's a lady in the audience that didn't like the ideas. Listen to this. Listen to this. Maybe I can get somebody to help me. The first single-engine ship to cross the Atlantic. I knew how to drive it. I knew how to fix the engine. My brother-in-law Hank knew how to run the engines. I had friends my age that were looking for adventure. They'd love to have that ship back in Scotland. Why don't we do a real journey and take it back to Scotland? Why not, dear? That was just one idea. Anyway, to go back to your question, the Lady Rose sold to the owner of Jamie's Whale Watching, which is a well-known tourist outfit in Clodagh and Tofino. They were planning to do things with it, which didn't materialize, probably for the same reason, the asbestos, the size, and whatnot. So they put it up for sale, and a consortium, a little bit of a society in Gibson's or Seychelles, decided that they would bring it back to their country because they wanted to recognize its life as Union steamships. And so they purchased it probably for $1, had it towed to Seychelles, and as far as I know, it's still sitting there. I've tried to make contact with them and see if they're interested in anything I can help them with, but they're doing it their way, so that's where it's sitting right now.
I heard that, I wasn't sure whether they've made any progress. It's been several years now.
No, I'm afraid I can't help you. I don't know. Yeah, it would be interesting. It would be great to know.
It's the last of its kind.
Yeah, it would be great to know. Yeah.
Well, let's go find out.
Huh?
What you doing this weekend?
Thank you.
I think, what are you doing this weekend? Let's go find out.
Well, there you are. I mean, the Port Alberni Maritime Society should sponsor a trip.
There
I'm gonna talk to the treasurer about that.
After we side the lighthouse and we do a few other things. Yeah.
Well, if we sell enough memberships tonight.
Are you selling up there? I hope. Let me count heads. How many new ones did you got? So, any,
What did you do for weather when you were traveling? For weather?
with the Lady Rose?
Yes. When you're traveling up and down, because you get down to Banfield, and there's quite a difference between Banfield and.
And Fluid, yeah. The Lady Rose, as far as I know, have never turned back for weather. In the early days, it used to go to Ucluelet during the winter, and some of the trips were unbelievably rough. And before the new engine was put in, the trip between the Broken Group of Islands and Ucluelet Harbor took over 4 hours because they were throwing the propeller out of the water. It was cavitating, and they had to reduce RPM. And it took over 4 hours to get through the Broken Group. And the story is that they were actually in communication with the Coast Guard because they thought things weren't going to go so well if that engine quit. But it never turned back for weather. So. And I don't believe it ever missed a trip. A little story. When the ship was built, it was built with the tanks that were going to be required to cross the Atlantic. It had a big fuel tank under the cargo hold. It had two fuel tanks built into the side of the hull. When it came to Canada, they took one of the fuel tanks and opened it up, and they lined it with cement so it could become a water tank. And the other fuel tank was left as it was, part of the hull. The vents to these tanks were up on deck. And to fill the water tank, all you did was put the garden hose into the vent and fill the water tank. Well, one engineer filled the water tank, and just as the ship was leaving the dock, the generator quit. And we were swinging on one line, and the main engine quit. So the skipper put another line on and looked for Joey the engineer and said, "What's going on down there?" And it turned out the water hose was put into the fuel.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
So, somebody asked about the Lady Rose in the tsunami that we had in '64. Well, because our father had some contact with the waterfront, he got an early phone call to say that there just could be something happening at the waterfront. So I was invited to go with Dad down to check it out. And as we arrived in Port Alberni, we were driving in front of the pulp mill. We met the first wave that was coming up, Gertrude. So we went up onto 10th Avenue and drove down Argyle Street, parked halfway down Argyle, ran down to the dock, which was by then lifted up by the big surge, and the Lady Rose was swinging on one rope. Other lines had broken, and it was swinging on one. We climbed on board, started the engine, and went out into the middle of the harbor, and when the next surge came, we were up and then down again. And by this time, other people had come, so we were able to come to the dock and pick up other crew members. So that's how the Lady Rose survived, on one rope. And our mother always insisted that they should get some kind of advertising revenue from that, because it was when polypropylene had first started to come into being, Up until then, we weren't using polypropylene, we were using hemp, and hemp left cable in it, and the poly line was what saved it, so, yeah. Pete's got a story.
I said, I just tell you, I watched that happen.
You watched it happen?
I was up by the sink of that house. And when the second one came in, we heard the lines break.
And you didn't help.
But he lived to tell about it.
So, okay, I won't go there.
We were chased away.
Best wildlife stories.
But,
Best wildlife, whales, eagles. Give me some wildlife.
oh, wildlife stories, yeah. You know, one of the best wildlife stories was eagles. Everybody loves eagles, especially Americans, they love eagles. So, we're going down the inlet, eagles and eagles and eagles. And one place that we always saw eagles was going into Kildalman. So here we are, I'm at the wheel, we're turning into Kildalman. A very excited tourist came up to the wheelhouse. Look, the eagle. And I said, oh, the bloody tourist department. Hey, what do you mean? I said, it's not a real eagle. They put it up there just so people take pictures. Oh my God. Of course it flew away. But we saw bears swimming. We saw, and it wasn't uncommon to see an eagle with a fish in the water, actually trying to get it to shore, actually splashing, you know. Wildlife was a big thing for people visiting the ship. Yeah. We did do a few emergency things with the Lady Rose. One of the saddest ones, and I wasn't on board at the time, but there was a family, they'd been out in the broken group in a small boat, and they had closed all the canvas up, and Mom and the kids fell asleep, and they were on their way back through Middle Channel on a nice glassy swell, and the carbon monoxide in the boat built up in the canvas, and they went up on barrier rocks. So Lady Rose was there for that. We made rescue missions at night. I remember one trip that we made to pick up a very badly injured logger that was hit with a choker, I believe, and we picked him up on Pocahontas Point in the dark of night and transferred him from a small tug, put him through the cargo hold door. It was a rescue ship at times, but most of the things were happy things on Lady Rose. I have
a little story with Brooke.
Huh?
A little story with Brooke. That on the Rose, he was loading with his big pallets in the morning, and Brooke was on the controls, and I was down in the hold. And Brooke always, oh, put that one there and put that one there. And one day he decided, the heck with it. He come down, oh, put that one on the starboard side. I said, no, I want it on the port side. And so I pushed it to the port side, and he ran off one of his ramps, and I said, Brooke, this is enough. And I stood up, and I went to the door, and said, I'll come and see you. And he locked all the doors in the wheelhouse, hiding in his little cabin. And I stayed down below, of course. And since that time, I could put it wherever I wanted.
The Lady Rose actually probably taught me more than anything else in my whole life. And one of the most iconic lessons I learned was about before the new engine was put in. The old engine had to have the oil changed about every 2 weeks. It would just turn black because of the carbon in it. And there was about 30 gallons of cold oil. So when I was about 14 years old, one of my jobs was to help change the oil on the weekends. So I would be down there in the cold engine room, and I'd have these gallons of fresh oil to pour into the base of this big engine. And we had the oil all stored in a big square tank that held probably 4 barrels of oil. Well, I was by myself down there, and oh God, the oil came out like honey into this gallon jug, and then I'd have to go pour it in the end. But I knew a little bit about air pressure. And I took an air hose and I stuck it into the top of the big square tank full of oil and turned on the air well just a little bit because I only want a little bit of air in this tank. And I turned it on, and sure enough, the oil came out faster. Thought pretty clever. So I went, dumped the oil in the main engine, and I went back, filled it up again, and it was coming out like a big stream of this golden oil was coming out. I'm pouring the second jug into the main engine when there's this sound behind me, and I turned around, and the valve that I just shut off had left the tank, and there was a 2-inch stream of honey oil going across the engine. Well, I was by myself, fortunately, and I just grabbed everything I could. I remember I used dust pins to, because it was like so thick to pick it up, and I'm trying to save it and trying to save it. And then I saw the khaki pants come down the, and my dad always wore khaki colored trousers, and he came, and I thought, oh, here we go. Anyway, it didn't materialize, nothing was said, nothing happened, and it took me about an hour, and it's coffee time, and I finally went back up there. I went into the coffee shop, and Dad just said, learned something about air pressure today, didn't you? Actually, the group of 7 artists, Arthur Lismer traveled on the Lady Rose, and I carried his bag down, and I was told that if he ever gave me something to keep it, he'd give it. We had, I should have mentioned, I mentioned, it's in my notes, honest. We did a lot of service for the First Nations people. They had Uchuckwissett Band, which didn't have road access, so we were servicing their band off their band houses all the time. Sarita, there was a dock in Sarita, and we serviced a lot of the First Nations people through Sarita. And some of them were so regular that they became kind of friends, like Percy Jackson, our father, took a really classic photograph of Percy Jackson, and it should be on the wall. He was a classic old First Nations man. And his sister Ella used to do her basket work on the ship whenever she came. And I got to recognize when she came down that she'd sit down in the same place, and I'd give her some water for her ants because they had to use a lot of water. Well, believe it or not, we went into Kildonan. I think it was in December because I was off on Christmas vacation. We went into Kildonan, and she met me at the dock in Kildonan and gave me an Aloe Nushell, which is, I still have it. And it was a gift for giving her water. One of the things that we handled quite regularly was the loggers. I mentioned Frank Singh's logging camp. Frank had a camp in Green Cove, and he also had a camp in Sea Shark. And Mondays, we would take them, and they'd stay in the bunkhouse all week, and then on Fridays, we'd pick them up, and it would be a good poker game in the cargo hold, lots to drink in the cargo hold, and sometimes it was pretty raucous down there. So, yeah, we had a lot of party times over there, not just tigers. A funny thing happened one time when we went to pick up the loggers in Green Cove. I was a deckhand. I was on the foredeck of the Lady Rose. There was a Beaver airplane ahead of us because it was picking up the loggers that were high rollers. They were going to fly to town, and the rest of the loggers were going to ride in on the Lady Rose. So as we're just tied up, I'm on the deck and I noticed the plane was just leaving, and they pushed it off, and it was just leaving the dock, and the pilot flashed up the big radial engine, and those big planes, they drip a lot of aviation fuel, and this flame came out of the radial engine, and it was sort of shooting down the side. The last logger was just stepping onto the plane, and the young deckhand on the Lady Rose said, "You're on fire." Well, the logger that was half on saw the flames, didn't quite make it to the dock, and ended up in the water. Well, the guy that hadn't fastened his seatbelt, he saw his buddy jump in the water, and he heard the word fire, so he jumped in the water. By the time there were 3 people trying to get out of the plane, the pilot gained control. My father had told me to get off the foredeck, and they sorted things out. So never yell fire unless you really know there's a fire.
They do that quite often. Just big wheels.
Questions? I haven't got the answers for. We towed a lot of people in with the Lady Rose. It wasn't uncommon to have somebody break down or hit a log or whatever, and we'd get a call on the radio and pick them up, and we'd throw them a line and tow them in. And it was, I'm sure sometimes it was just a free ride for some people because they just didn't want to buy the gas. But,
Yeah.
I remember that when kayaking got to be quite popular, then the Lady Rose got into that. They would take people down with their kayaks and launch and take them to a float somewhere in the broken group and drop them off and pick them up. And that was, I did that once with some friends. It was quite a popular thing to do.
At Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Float at Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Yeah, and nobody, we didn't have tows in those days. And people came on the ship and they had the gear, and so we loaded in the hold, and then there's group number 1, group number 2, group number 3, and depending on how many there were, there were all these heaps of clothing and life jackets and everything from people, and then the boats went on top, and in those days it was all canoes. You hardly saw it in the kayak. And then the canoes you got up, and when we went to Gibraltar on the float, there was only the big float there, and then all the gear came out, and the full float, and 20, 30 people on the little float, and it was stood like this, and then the gear came out, and then the boats went over the side, and they caught them, and they went in the water, and then it was all done, and we take the line away, and said, "Have fun, guys!" We took off, and then the whole float full with people in gear and canoes. But in the afternoon, we came back to pick people up to go back to town, and they were all gone, so it always worked.
Well, they weren't swimming.
No, they weren't swimming.
No. But you're right, kayaking it bloomed in the broken group, and that there was, and of course the Lady Rose Company purchased the property at Sea Sharp, and once again Brooke George's wisdom and smarts, he purchased the old pulp mill office building, put it on the barge, took it down there, and created a lodge, and then somebody used to look after that lodge. 250 ice boxes of fish. The bow would be way down, but it would be so stable. It was a very, very stable. I was telling David earlier how difficult it was to handle and to maneuver when the bow was way down. But it was, nobody ever did any calculations for how much weight we took and everything else. But I do recall when the logging industry was booming, one of the things they used to use down at the logging camps was what they called banding or strapping. And it was a band of steel that was all coiled up like a big, and a stack of that banding weighed almost 1.5 tons or 2 tons. And it was just about too much for the cargo rigging to lift one of these pallets. And because it was the first stop for the Lady Rose to arrive in Kildonan where they were using this banding, it was pretty convenient to put it on deck. Well, at the time, I'd left working on the Lady Rose. I was working for the logging company, and I happened to be on the dock when the Lady Rose came around the point. And I took one look at her, and she was just rolling so slowly. I said, what's going on? And it came to the dock, and she just rolled the other way so slowly. What in the heck is going on? And then I see the skipper, I won't mention him, he's not here, and the skipper had loaded about 12 of these stacks of seal banding on the deck. He was white. He said, never again will I do that. And what he had done was raise the center of gravity, and the ship was in very, very close to getting into trouble with that kind of a... One of the things that used to happen when we had a real load of passengers on board, if something really interesting was happening on the side deck, of course, all the passengers would go to one side. And it would take quite a list. You get 100 people up on the top deck, and it would take a bit of a list. That's okay, as long as you're not unloading a Caterpillar engine or something with the derricks, because more than once we had to ask over the PA system, would some of the folks please go to the other side? Because there was a danger of, too much of a list, and when you get that center of gravity too high, it's bad news, Yeah. So. No, I never met you on the Lady Rose, dear. I have a son back there that used to travel on the Lady Rose sometimes, and he's awful quiet. So.
How many marriages were done by the captain?
Say it again?
How many marriages?
I don't think we ever did any marriages, no. No. I was just trying to think, we did a wedding in Poets Nook. Babe Gunn's daughter got married in Poets Nook on Lady Rose.
You put the Lady Rose into Poet?
Yeah.
Tight fit.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Once the Lady Rose had engine room control, it was an entirely different ship. I was going to mention this, I forgot. In the early days, when it was ding, 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 and engine room control, because the maneuvering was not as precise and everything, coming alongside a dock, there was always a heaving line. The mate would look after the spring line and get the spring line ashore, and then you'd do your maneuver to get into the dock, and then you'd put your lines on. Once the skipper had wheelhouse control and very precise control, the Lady Rose, it was a lovely ship to handle. You could put it alongside anything, and we always got, I shouldn't say always, often got a lot of compliments from very experienced mariners when they would spend a day with us. And sometimes we'd do 20 or 30 landings with that ship. We'd go along float cabins, and we'd go alongside a boat that stopped. We'd go into a busy little place with fish boats everywhere. We'd poke it in there and unload some cargo and leave. And it was a really nice ship to handle when you had that wheelhouse control. Yeah. We loved it. I was single when I was skipper, you see. And even before I got on, when we were deckhands, I wish some of my fellow deckhands were here, because it was...
So do I.
Right?
So do I.
It was the people that wanted to work for the summer months on the Lady Rose. It was unbelievable. Everybody would love that job. It was long days, but a lot of time sitting having a coffee, lots of time talking to tourists, and it was so healthy. It was such a good life, and we always had fun. If you were a good crew member, if you did your job, you had a good time. There was one instance we had. When I was really, really young, my dad had trouble with one of the deckhands. I think he was a deckhand. Anyways, I can remember he didn't belong. And something happened when they were loading the cargo, and he was reprimanded. There were some eggs in the cargo, and he took one of the eggs. And when you ran the winch, the skipper usually stood at the window running the winch. And the deckhand took one of the eggs and hurled it at the wheelhouse where my father was running the winch. Well, expecting all hell to break loose and, you know, knowing that that was the end of his job, he waited and nothing happened. And they continued on loading and nothing happened. And then my father said, you gotta clean this mess up now. And he, I guess I got away with it. And he cleaned it up. Get your ass off this ship and you're not coming back again. So that was a lesson. Get the guy to clean it up first. And then oh yeah, Dick's pipe. Dick's pipe was something else. He used to, that pipe was in his mouth all the time. And, you know, he'd have his head out the wheelhouse if it was raining and the pipe would be upside down. And, you know, and this, I love the smell of the old chum pipe tobacco. It's really nice, actually. But for a birthday or Christmas, somebody gave him a fancy pipe. And it had like a cooling coil in it, and it was chrome, you know. Well, Dick came on the ship the next morning and brought this for my birthday and probably throw the compass off. Anyway, my dad says it's probably made out of aluminum, it probably won't affect the compass. He used to keep his pipe in the rack right by the window of the wheelhouse, and then he'd go down and have coffee sometimes, and somebody put a 1/8 drill bit into the side of his pipe. The compass sort of followed it around. The pipe went overboard.
Oh, wow.
I just remembered a funny little incident that we did. The Lady Rose had a cabin behind the wheelhouse, which at one time was the skipper's cabin, I guess, but it was mostly just used for anything unusual. And quite often we have somebody order a birthday cake or a bouquet of flowers or something, and so it would be handed onto the bridge and then it would be put in the cabin behind the wheelhouse, and then we would look after it until it got delivered to whoever was going. The other thing that used to happen was when the fish buyers out in Downfield were buying the fish from the fishermen, they used to buy it with cash. So they had to have lots of money in hand. And the banker used to come down and have a sealed brown envelope. And of course we didn't open it, we didn't know, but it was said to contain cash. Well, that was normal. My father and Dick McMinn on it, and that's fine. So the banker would give the envelope to them, and they would say, well, go put it under the mattress in the cabin or something, so we'd hide the envelope. Well, we were in Banfield, and we'd unloaded all our cargo. Then we'd moved over to BC Packers float, and we'd loaded all these boxes of fish, and everybody's tired and cranky, and it's time to get home. We're just pulling out from BC Packers dock, and I remember the owner was Barney Smith. Barney said, what about the envelope? And by this time, we backed away from the dock. And my father says, oh, Joey, go in the cabin, get that envelope, it's under the mattress. So I went there. There were lots of envelopes in there. And there were a few magazines. So I put a magazine in and I sauntered out onto the foredeck, and by this time Dad was, because it didn't maneuver very well, he was trying to put the bow in, and we were about 20 feet from the dock, and I threw the envelope in the water, and oh, well, Jesus Christ. The envelope was in the water. I'm standing there with a grin on my face, and then of course, not just the dollar, but the penny dropped. My father had told me, go get the envelope.
That's
so,
a good one.
anyway. But we used to carry CODs sometimes, and of course a lot of people didn't pay their bills. And my dad had moved on, and I was alternate skippering with Dick McMinn. I would skipper one week and Dick would skipper another. And when there weren't many passengers, sometimes we would stop and we would jig for cod and things like that out in the middle channel. It was great fun, you know, we had a good deal. Well, Dick McMinn came down one weekend, and it's his week to come on, and he came storming out of the wheelhouse. Who's the COD for? I said, I don't think I forgot anything, Dick. Well, the COD in the wheelhouse. The COD in the wheelhouse? Yeah, COD for jigs. Jigs, somebody. I never heard of jigs. These are cod jigs. When the Lady Rose was being quite successful because of the logging industry, our father could see the need for a high-speed passenger vessel. So I was part of the company. We built, or had built, a 65-foot crew boat called the Seaway Express. And as the Seaway Express went into business, and when I first got my skipper's ticket, I was more or less put on the job as running the Seaway Express. When I'd done that for a year, my wife and I had built a sailboat, and we went offshore sailing. And while we were gone, it was time for Dad to retire, so he sold the Lady Rose. And a lot of people have said to me, gee whiz, why didn't you hang around? You could have had that, No, it was one of the best things that ever happened, because it went into fresh blood, it went into better, smarter people than I was. I would have just done the same thing over and over again. It went into good management, and I have no regrets about that. But to answer your question, Chris, when I came back, I was given the opportunity to do a lot of relief work running the Lady Rose. So I guess the last trip I made when I was working for Brook George, and I can't remember specifically that trip, but that's when it happened, I guess. And I remember the last trip the Lady Rose made out of the inlet. Our family was there. There was a picture on the wall of our family being there. They couldn't get the engine started. And Hank had done it, I'd done it. We're standing on the dock looking, I know what they're not doing. Finally, somebody came up and said, could you show us what's going on down here? And Hank went down and started the engine for them. So that was the last time the Lady Rose left Port Alberni.